This is chapter 4. Chapter 4 is focusing on ancient Rome. This lecture is not going to focus on the entire chapter. This is kind of part 1, kind of the early Republic, and then more early Rome. It's also going to cover the early Republic and the late Republic. And then we'll stop, and then I'll start another lecture with kind of the change in Rome that occurs under Augustus. So ancient Rome, Rome kind of emerges as a civilization around 1000 BCE. And if you look at the map, Rome is right here. Italy was kind of organized into different groups or clans. And you had the Etruscans over here in the north. You had the Latins or the Latiums here just in the middle. And then the Greeks kind of controlled, this part of modern day Italy. So lots of different groups, but you're going to see civilization, grow here, mostly because of the geography. Um, Greece was also a peninsula, and we know it wasn't very unified, but the Roman Empire, at least early Rome, would unify. These small little kingdoms would eventually become, ancient Rome. Italy was known for, it was an easier location to trade, less rugged terrain than Greece, so travel and trade was much easier. The Romans, or this empire, was most influenced by the Etruscans. The Etruscans were in northern Italy, right here. And we also know that the Roman alphabet was influenced by the Greeks. So what did the Romans learn from the Etruscans? The Etruscans taught the people of this area how to build with stone, mine, iron, make metal weapons, also build roads, temples, and also some military tactics. So again, just to kind of summarize, Rome was not initially, Rome was broken up into different groups. Eventually, all of these groups would unify under one centralized government located here in Rome. All right, early Rome. The mythology is that Rome, the city of Rome, was founded by Romulus. And the story goes, Romulus and Remus were brothers around 753 BC. And the king didn't want them to take over power, so he had them killed. The person who was supposed to kill them just abandoned them. And these two brothers right here were actually raised by wolves as children. They would grow up, and eventually Romulus would found Rome. It's a myth, and there is evidence that it was based on an Asian myth that was very similar. So the myth of Romulus and Remus was really just a Romanized version of this Asian myth. But it is lore, and that's where, Romulus is the idea of Rome comes from the name Romulus. Rome is located near rivers, and that's important. So the river water was used to help irrigation. Obviously, the rivers provided drinking water and metals. Rome was also close. Again, the Tiber River is this river, and it was near the Tyrrhenian Sea. So this is going to be a place to trade. It was easy to defend because it was surrounded by hills and this river. It was not on the coast. It was a little inland. But overall, it was a very central point for trade in Italy. It was not hard to get to Rome in terms of trade, but it was a little more difficult to, say, conquer this city. All right. Early on, Rome is a monarchy. The early king, his name was Tarquin the Proud, around 500 BC. And Rome was divided into different social groups. We talk about social class or social stratification. On the top, you had patricians, and on the bottom, you had plebeians. Rome is best known for basically transforming into a representative government or a republic. Unlike Greece, the people of Rome did not have a direct say in government. Like our government, they would elect leaders. Rome was also secular, meaning religion and government didn't really mix all that much. There was limited religious influence that was not necessarily the case in Greece, but in Rome it was, and that's important because again, that's how we are today. We are a secular society where religion and government are kind of separated. So we mentioned the patricians. They're on top of the social class. They're the wealthiest citizens. They are landowners, and they made up the Senate. And you could be a senator if you were a patrician, and it was a position for life. Unlike our senators, who are only a term for a senator is 6 years. Senators can run for years, but it's not necessarily known for as a lifetime term. So, again, the patricians were on the upper end of the social scale. So be familiar with that grouping. And again, this is a republic, and a republic is a representative government, and we'll get into more detail in a second. So this republic was born out around 509 BCE. All right. The lower class, they were known as plebeians. They were small farmers, traders, craft workers, and soldiers. Below them would be your slaves. They did have citizenship, but like in Greece, not all men were citizens, and women and slaves were not either. Politically, plebeians were represented by two assemblies, the assemblies of tribes and centuries. If you look at the map, the senators or the patricians were here. The citizen assemblies or the tribes and the centuries were down on the bottom, but they could pass laws. They could select government officials called magistrates, and they could also decide legal matters in courts. This is a great example of bureaucracy. We keep using that term. It's a government filled with different positions. Tribunes were kind of equal to the senators. There were fewer tribunes. They represented the citizen assemblies in the Senate. They did have some veto power, but the senators would usually trump the power of the tribunes by kind of bribing the plebeians and getting the plebeians to support their ideas and their beliefs with games, with food, with parties. So for the most part, the senators kind of dominated the political spectrum. Above the senators were consuls who were chosen by senators, kind of like modern day presidents, but there were two consuls and they would kind of counteract each other. They were elected, again, by the Senate, and they would kind of oversee the military. Again, it's an executive branch of government in a sense, very similar to our president. But because they could veto each other, not a lot was always getting done. There was a checks and balance system in a sense. So we see a lot of similarities with our own government structure, and that's the legacy of the Romans. They did model republican government. Like Hammurabi, like the Ten Commandments, like Cyrus's cylinder, the Romans also had a code of law. Their code was known as the 12 Tables, mostly to appease plebeians, to kind of make sure that, or kind of like a Bill of Rights, to make sure that they felt like their rights were being protected from the patricians. It outlined business transactions or guidelines, penalties for crimes, and again, it's very similar to our Bill of Rights, which was used to appeal, or which was created to appeal to our founding fathers who were concerned about the new democracy. Because there were laws, Rome did have lawyers, and legal cases were brought up against corrupt officials. Cicero is one of the early legal minds of the classical era, and his writings are still studied in law school today. So again, there's legacy, and that's what you want to remember for the Romans. Their political legacy and their cultural legacies, and their military legacies as well. And here you go. These are the 12 tables. All right, so a little bit about Roman expansion. So again, early on, Rome is Italy. Those kingdoms or those regions would unite, and you have the early Roman Empire. But Rome was a military power, and by 148 BC, they conquer most of Alexander's empire, and also Carthage is conquered. And this is Carthage. It's northern Africa. Today it would be Libya, parts of Egypt, and the wars between the Carthaginians, again, they were the Phoenicians. If we go back to the early Phoenicians, the wars were known as the Punic Wars. This is a key concept, which would be kind of military takeover or state building. Around 146 BC, the Roman destroyed Carthage and enslaved the population. They also were brutal. They would wipe out farmland by salting the land to starve the people into submission. It was known as the Carthaginian Peace, which really wasn't peaceful. It was basically the complete destruction of the enemy. But it's more evidence of conquest. So if you can remember the Punic Wars, it's a great example of, again, a state conquering another state, the Punic Wars. By the time the empire had established itself, the Romans controlled France, parts of England, Egypt, Sicily, Spain, Greece, and Germany. Europe was under the control of the Roman Empire. So it's really considered the greatest or largest empire in the history of the world. Mostly because of their military prowess, soldiers were very successful, mostly because they were rewarded and also punished. So rewards could be food, land, gifts, and punishments could be execution if these soldiers didn't perform in battle or didn't fight effectively. Soldiers ranged from the age of 17 to 46. They were citizens who owned land, but they were mostly plebeians and poor farmers. There's a lot of cultural diffusion. Get used to that term. And it's basically when two cultures kind of merge, and the Romans and the Greeks had a lot of syncretism where they kind of synchronize. The Romans adapted elements of Greek religion, the idea of polytheism, and even certain gods. Greek law influenced Cicero and other legal minds. And because the Romans were known for building these roads, they were able to connect their empire very easily. So people from Spain or people from Europe could travel and trade, or at least, you see the diffusion of information or ideas. So these roads are very important, again, to, for uniting this empire and allowing for culture to transfer from one place to another. Well, what was it like to be conquered? Rome, like many of the civilizations, had a centralized government, but in order to govern these other regions, there were governors who would oversee the Carthaginians or the Spanish or the Europeans. Kind of like the Persian satraps, if you go back, that's what Darius and Cyrus would also hire or have governors or men that would oversee their region, kind of like, have a bureaucracy, another word. Most of the conquered people were not citizens or were not given citizenship. It was also difficult to collect taxes. So a new position was created, a tax farmer, and it was his job to collect taxes, and he was allowed to keep a portion of those taxes. The problem was that these men were corrupt, and they would actually overtax their people, still give the right amount to the Rome, but then he would have a larger portion for himself. These men were part of a new class that's emerging. We'll kind of talk about it in a little bit. The equines class. These were businessmen, or it's a businessman or a commercial class. And the equines kind of originated from, equestrian soldiers. So they were kind of again, more of a business class that's emerging. So kind of in between plebeians and patricians in a sense, a middle class, early middle class. All right, a little bit about society. We have the plebeians on top, the patricians in the middle. We have the equines kind of emerging between the two. On the bottom were slaves. They were war captives, whether they were Greek slaves or Carthaginian slaves. They worked on farms. They worked in homes. They were educated, but that didn't really matter. They still didn't have any citizenship rights. And they were often used to raise wealthy children, especially the Greek slaves. They were usually utilized in the homes of the patricians. Very famous rebellion called Spartacus's rebellion. That's a concept too throughout this time period. Examples of usually slave rebellion or any kind of peasant rebellion. This is a famous movie with Kirk Douglas from the 50s or 40s, maybe. Kirk Douglas is the father of Michael Douglas, if you've ever heard of Michael Douglas. He was in Wall Street. He was also in a movie called, I forgot what it was called, but you'd recognize him if you saw him. Um, but anyway, Spartacus was a slave who led a pretty successful slave revolt in 73 BCE. But what it actually wasn't very successful because it ended up resulting in harsher conditions. Kind of what happened in the United States after a slave revolt. The slave laws or the codes would get stiffer and tighter to prevent another revolt. Um, Slavery was not good for Rome. It really resulted in a slow economic process, a lack of innovation, and that kind of happened in the South too. The owners or the landowners had no reason to really work hard. Their slaves did most of the work. So there was really no incentive to improve their technology. They just basically got rich hand over foot without looking to enhance anything. Why change a system when it works? But that didn't really help Roman society over time. So the Spartacus rebellion is a great rebellion to remember. At least a Roman rebellion where slaves were unhappy with their conditions. All right, so small farmers or patricians didn't do very well either. Like in the United States, small farmers couldn't compete with these slave estates, so they went out of business. And a lot of these small farmers would move to Rome, and that would lead to increasing poverty in the city of Rome. A famous consul named Tiberius Gracchus recognized this and actually looked to change the social situation or economic situation. And he had an idea of giving land or taking land from the rich and giving it to the poor. Well, a lot of patricians weren't too happy, and a few senators assassinated Tiberius. But we do see attempts at reform, right? Kind of early socialism. All right, a little bit about women. This is going to be the last slide today, and then we're going to stop. Women, at least in early Rome, were very limited in their rights, similar to Greece. Only men could be citizens. Women could not vote. No property ownership for most. Wealthy women did get an education and could inherit property. But most women were focused on education. Also, women were younger than their husbands. They married younger. Most men were in their 30s or late 20s, and women were as young as 16, 17, or 18. So really, a very interesting society where women were kind of brought up to be subordinate to men. Okay. All right, so we're going to stop there. I'll do another lecture tomorrow. There's going to be a change. The republic is going to kind of end in a sense, and you're going to see dictators emerge like Julius Caesar. Okay.